What if I told you there was an experiment so horrifying, so utterly inhumane, that it makes other wartime atrocities seem almost comprehensible? A practice so chilling that its victims didn't just perish, they endured unimaginable suffering, fully aware of their bodies being dismantled piece by piece. For decades, this dark chapter remained shrouded in silence, its details too gruesome to fathom. It was designed not just to kill, but to strip away every shred of humanity, leaving only agony in its wake. This is the chilling story of vivisection, the most disturbing World War II experiment you've never heard of. Welcome to Through the Ages, where we uncover the hidden truths and darkest corners of history. If you're fascinated by the stories that shaped our past, don't forget to like and subscribe to join our journey through time. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a video. So what exactly was vivisection? Imagine being strapped to a cold operating table, surrounded by masked figures wielding scalpels. Your body is cut open, organs removed, and experimental fluids injected, all while you're awake, with no anesthesia to dull the pain. This wasn't a nightmare. This was a reality for American prisoners of war at Kyushu University in Japan during the final months of World War II. Known as vivisection, these experiments were among the most brutal acts of human experimentation ever recorded, with historical accounts detailing victims enduring unimaginable torment before their bodies finally gave out. But where did this practice originate, and how do we know about it? The term vivisection comes from the Latin words vivus, meaning alive, and sectio, meaning cutting. It describes the act of performing surgical operations on living subjects for experimental purposes. While typically associated with animal testing, during World War II, the Japanese military applied it to humans, most notoriously at Unit 731 in China. But today, we're focusing on a lesser-known yet equally horrific case at Kyushu University's medical school in Fukuoka, Japan. Why was such an extreme method chosen? Vivisection wasn't just about medical research. It was a deliberate act of dehumanization, a message to enemies and a tool to advance military science at any cost. The most detailed account of these experiments comes from post-war trials and testimonies, particularly from Toshio Tono, a medical student who witnessed the horrors firsthand. He described how American airmen, captured after their B-29 was shot down, were subjected to these procedures. But who were these men, and why were they chosen? On May 5, 1945, a B-29 Superfortress from the 29th Bomb Group, 6th Bomb Squadron, was shot down near Takeda, Japan, during a bombing mission. The crew, part of the U.S. Army Air Forces, included men like Staff Sergeant Teddy Ponczka and Private Dale Plambeck. Of the 11 aboard, 8 survived the crash, only to face a fate far worse than death. Taken to Kyushu University's medical school, they were selected for experiments not because of crimes, but because they were convenient subjects, enemy prisoners in a desperate war. The Japanese military, facing imminent defeat, sought to gain medical knowledge that could aid their forces, no matter the human cost. Tono's accounts, later documented in his book Disgrace, reveal how these airmen were subjected to vivisection. Over several days in May and June 1945, they endured procedures that defy comprehension. But there's something unsettling about this story. For years, the truth was buried, with attempts to claim the men died in the Hiroshima bombing. Historians have since pieced together the reality through trial records and survivor testimonies. Was vivisection as widespread as claimed, or was Kyushu an isolated case? The truth is, we know it happened, and its possibility alone is chilling enough. The idea that human minds could devise such cruelty, is a haunting reminder of war's darkest depths. The term vivisection was used by the Japanese themselves, though some records refer to these acts as special operations or medical experiments. In Western accounts, they're often called live dissections, a term that captures their brutality. Some historians speculate similar methods were used elsewhere, like Unit 731, where thousands endured comparable fates. For example, in post-war literature, references to human experimentation echo in works like Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, where the horrors of war's dehumanization are laid bare. While fictional, these nods show how vivisection's legacy lingered in the human psyche. And now, let's face the true horror of what happened at Kyushu. The first step in vivisection was stripping the victims of everything: their freedom, their dignity, their humanity. The airmen, already weakened from their crash, were brought to a sterile operating theater at Kyushu University. Stripped of their uniforms, they were strapped to tables under harsh lights, surrounded by doctors and medical students. The setting was clinical, but the intent was anything but humane. There was no room to struggle, no way to escape, only the cold reality of what was to come. At first, the men might have clung to hope, thinking they'd face interrogation or imprisonment. But vivisection was not about mercy. It was about pushing the limits of human endurance, using living bodies as test subjects until they broke. The procedures began with chilling precision. On May 17, 1945, 2 airmen had their lungs removed to study respiratory effects. The doctors, led by figures like Professor Fukujiro Ishiyama, worked methodically, their scalpels cutting through flesh as the men screamed in agony. No anesthesia was used, either by design or due to shortages, ensuring every cut was felt. The victims remained conscious, their hearts racing as their bodies were violated. The next step was even more harrowing. On May 22nd, 2 more airmen underwent operations where their stomachs, hearts, and livers were manipulated or removed. The goal was to test organ function and surgical techniques, but the result was torture. One man's liver was partially excised, and he was stitched up to see how long he'd survive. Another had his heart exposed, the doctors observing its beats before he succumbed. Each procedure was a lesson in cruelty, conducted before an audience of students who took notes as the men's lives faded. And the worst part? This was repeated daily. On May 25th, 1 airman endured brain surgery, his skull drilled open to study the trigeminal nerve. Blood and brain matter spilled as he died from hemorrhage. On June 2nd, 3 more faced similar fates, with one injected with seawater to test it as a saline substitute, his body convulsing in pain. As the men lay on those tables, the operating theater became a chamber of horrors, the air filled with the sounds of their gasps, the clink of surgical tools, and the murmurs of observers. Infection set in quickly, with wounds left untreated to study decay. The victims' bodies began to fail. Organs shut down, blood loss weakened their hearts, and septic shock loomed. Yet death was not swift. Some lingered for hours, their minds trapped in bodies that could no longer function. Can you imagine the terror of feeling your own heart stop, knowing there's nothing you can do? Days passed, and the torment continued. The airmen were kept alive just long enough to serve their purpose. Dehydration and exhaustion became additional torturers, their lips cracking and throats raw from screaming. They begged for mercy, but all they received was more pain. The doctors ensured they didn't die too quickly, monitoring their vitals to prolong the experiments. Some were placed in formaldehyde post-mortem, their bodies preserved as if to erase the crime. The final toll was 8 lives, each extinguished in a way no human should endure. But for those who witnessed vivisection, the horror didn't end there. The operating theater, once a place of learning, became a graveyard of ethics. The students, like Toshio Tono, carried the weight of what they saw, their silence a testament to the trauma. What remained were the memories of men reduced to specimens, their humanity stripped away under the guise of science. We've mentioned that these experiments took place in Japan, but to fully understand their purpose, we need to step back and examine the empire that allowed them. The Imperial Japanese Empire, a formidable power in the early 20th century, was built on discipline, militarism, and an unwavering belief in its divine destiny. Under emperors like Hirohito, Japan expanded across Asia, driven by a complex mix of nationalism and survival. But it was also an empire that dehumanized its enemies. By 1945, with defeat looming, desperation fueled acts of unimaginable cruelty. Japanese military culture was rigid, with strict codes of loyalty. Soldiers were trained to see surrender as dishonor, and prisoners were often viewed as less than human. This mindset permeated institutions like Kyushu University, where medical professionals, caught in the war's fervor, abandoned ethics for expediency. Vivisection wasn't just about science. It was a statement of dominance, a way to extract value from those deemed worthless. The experiments were reserved for the most expendable, enemy POWs, whose suffering served as both research and retribution. Unlike typical wartime executions, vivisection was not a public spectacle. It was conducted behind closed doors, in sterile rooms where the screams were muffled by academic detachment. Yet its purpose was no less psychological. The knowledge of such experiments, even if rumored, struck fear into Allied forces. Imagine being a pilot, knowing capture might mean not just death, but becoming a living lab rat. Would you risk flying over Japan? The Japanese military, despite its technological advancements, had a darker side when it came to prisoners. While they developed radar and aircraft, they also developed methods to break the human spirit. Vivisection stood out as the most calculated, a blend of science and sadism that pushed boundaries no one should cross. Alongside other atrocities, like Unit 731's plague experiments or the Bataan Death March, it reminded the world that power, unchecked, breeds horror. The next time vivisection surfaced, it was years after Japan's surrender, when Allied investigators unearthed its secrets. In 1948, the Fukuoka war crimes trials brought 30 Kyushu University staff to justice, thanks to testimonies from survivors like Tono and documents uncovered by the Allies. The trials, held in Yokohama, revealed a chilling truth. 23 were convicted, with 5 sentenced to death and 4 to life imprisonment. Yet, by 1958, all were released, a decision influenced by Cold War politics and a U.S. executive order. The leniency left scars, especially for families like Gertrude Plambeck, mother of Dale Plambeck, who wrote tirelessly to the War Department, only learning of her son's fate in 1950. Tono, now 89 and a clinic director, became a voice for truth. His book Disgrace and his support for Kyushu University's museum exhibit ensured the story wasn't forgotten. Writing in the 21st century, he painted a vivid picture of suffering, not just recounting the procedures, but explaining their psychological toll. Vivisection was more than an experiment. It was a weapon of despair, designed to break the spirit as much as the body. The victims weren't just killed, they were erased, their identities reduced to case studies in a twisted quest for knowledge. Most wartime deaths were swift, bullets, bombs, or gas chambers. But vivisection stretched suffering to its limits, forcing victims to endure their own destruction. Every cut, every injection worsened their state. The sterile room reeked of blood and antiseptic. The sounds of drills and labored breathing filled the air. They felt everything: the scalpel's bite, the tug of organs, the burn of seawater in their veins, but could do nothing. The true horror was the hopelessness. They knew death was coming, but not when. Their minds, alert despite their failing bodies, bore witness to every second. And if the pain wasn't enough, vivisection stripped its victims of dignity. They were treated like specimens, their bodies probed and discarded, unable to resist or even plead. They were reduced to objects, not just in their own minds, but in the eyes of their tormentors. And yes, there were always watchers, students scribbling notes, doctors debating outcomes, all complicit in the crime. Vivisection wasn't hidden in a dungeon. It was performed in a university, a place meant for learning, now a stage for horror. Witnesses left with fear and guilt, knowing they'd seen something no one should. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect was the role of the perpetrators. Unlike a firing squad, vivisection required precision and persistence. Doctors had to plan each cut, monitor vital signs, and record results, all while ignoring the screams. Someone had to do this. Men like Professor Ishiyama, who saw science where others saw suffering. But was vivisection really that bad? The answer is yes. Its legacy influenced later atrocities, from Nazi experiments to modern ethical debates. The Nazis, for instance, conducted their own human experiments, like Mengelé's twin studies, designed to push medical boundaries at the cost of lives. The Allies, too, weren't blameless. British camps like Bad Nendorf used torture, though less surgically precise. Vivisection's echoes persisted, inspiring post-war ethical codes like the Nuremberg Code, which demanded consent and humane treatment. Yet even these codes couldn't erase the stain. In Japan, similar methods surfaced in Unit 731, where prisoners were infected with plagues or frozen to study frostbite. These acts lacked vivisection's surgical focus, but shared its cruelty, letting science justify suffering. The 20th century carried vivisection's shadow. During the Cold War, rumors of human experiments persisted, from Soviet labs to CIA programs. While less documented, they showed how war's desperation lingers. Vivisection remained unique, though. Other methods caused pain, but vivisection turned victims into living experiments, their bodies a canvas for curiosity. No other act so perfectly blended intellect and inhumanity, a punishment not just of the body but of the soul. Vivisection wasn't just a way to die, it was a descent into a fate worse than death. For those who learned of it, it became the ultimate nightmare, the most disturbing experiment ever conceived. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's darkest chapters. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with Through the Ages. Share your thoughts in the comments. What other hidden histories should we uncover? Until next time, keep exploring the past with us.